Thanks so much for joining us. Yuripzy Morgan, tell us why you wanted to run for Congress in the first place.
Well, thanks again for having me, Mackenzie. Look, I think it's pretty simple. I grew up in an immigrant household. You know, both my parents are immigrants. My dad is from Mexico. My mom fled the Civil War in El Salvador, and I grew up in a household that was very appreciative of this country, not just because of what we were taught, but because of what they experienced. So now in my legal practice, and then in the time that I had when I was on WBAL doing the midday political talk radio show, all I did was talk politics for 4 hours a day, 5 days a week. And it was frustrating to see the decline of so many of the institutions in this country that not only do we hold dear, but that really do set us apart from other countries all across the globe and protect our freedoms. And when I saw that there was an opportunity to do something about it rather than talk about it, I had to take it.
And here we are.
And here we are.
You brought up immigration. I want to start with that conversation because obviously it's in the news right now. Where do you stand on this, what we're seeing some leaders do in terms of busing migrants from some places to other cities? Do you agree with that? Do you think that's a good strategy?
I'm so glad you brought this up, Mackenzie, because one of the things that I want to do in Congress is actually introduce legislation to fix the immigration issue. All of what we're seeing are desperate attempts at a Band-Aid, and it has been almost close to 1986 was the last time that we had real immigration reform. That was the last time, 1986. I mean, think about that. I was 2 years old, and in that time, rather than really solve the issue, what we have seen is both sides, Republicans and Democrats, use immigration as a political football. Think about the decision yesterday, the Fifth Circuit decision on DACA.
Yep.
DACA, the legality of DACA has always been in question because it's an issue of separation of powers. It is an unconstitutional declaration from the president, but what we could do is actually fix the problem, and that's where Congress comes into play. That's where Congress has to have real legislation that fixes this problem, that secures our borders, that actually provides a pathway to some sort of a legal status for those who are here in this country, and then deal with the legal immigration problem that way.
What does that fix look like? From your perspective, if you were elected, what type of legislation would you introduce?
So the first thing that we would do is we'd introduce legislation that works in two ways. There are two problems that we have here. One is the border. You cannot have an open, porous border. It's almost like you're on a boat and it's sinking. The very first thing that you have to do is plug the hole, and then you can start dealing with the water that's here, right? What we need to do is make sure that we have a secure structure at our border.
Like a wall?
It could be a wall, but let's be honest, we've got to be practical about this as well. I am from Texas. There are a lot of areas on the southern border that are private land,
right,
and certain areas where you cannot put a physical barrier, but you can use technology, you can lease land. It does not require us to, forego our conservative principles and take land, as some have suggested that the government do. No, there's real ways that we can do this. At the same time, and realistically, that will have to be done for the most part, completed or almost completed, before we can then turn around and maybe do something similar to what we did in 1986 and allow a legal status for the people who are here. We are not going to be able to you're not going to get rid of what the estimates, some as low as 12 million, some as high as 18 million people who are here undocumented in this country. And the reality is, it's political. This is a common sense approach, but when Republicans say it, they get called xenophobes. When Democrats come up with half the piece of the puzzle, they refuse to talk about the border security. And maybe it takes somebody like me, somebody with an immigrant background. As I said, my dad's from Mexico. My mother came to the U.S. from the Civil War in El Salvador. Maybe it takes somebody like me to stand up in Congress and say, enough with the politics, here's the solution. And oh, by the way, you can't tell me that this isn't something that I understand. I understand it very clearly.
Are leaders who are busing migrants, are they playing politics with these migrants' lives?
I think it's a desperate attempt to show people how complex, or not even complex, let me rephrase that. I think it's a desperate attempt to show other people across the country, excuse me, how bad the situation has gotten.
Should they be doing it though?
No, I mean, I think it's kind of similar to a child that acts out. Like when you get to a point, and I think we've probably all done that, Mackenzie, you get to a point where you have said till you're blue in the face. This is the problem. Somebody listen to me. This is what's going on. And what ends up happening? An explosion. You get frustrated. You throw a fit. Whatever it is. And I think that's what you're seeing. No, that's I think a part of what the problem is, that we're using these people as just a political football. And the reality is that it is a huge burden on those border states and those border cities. And so I think if we really wanted to solve that problem, if we really wanted to stop any of Governor Ron DeSantis or any of these folks from busing people to Massachusetts or wherever they were going, it's because we've got to have real, clear immigration solutions.
In your latest ad, you talk about your immigration background and some of the priorities, but you also talk about Governor Hogan. And is that the type of Republican you would like to portray yourself as to potential voters?
Yeah, I mean, look, the reality is Governor Hogan and I have a lot of similarities. He is his own person. I am my own person. I think what people like so much about Governor Hogan are the characteristics. The characteristics that say, look, and we just talked about the immigration issue, and if you bring up the Dobbs decision as well, there are certain instances where you do have to tell your own party no, and that should be common sense to all of us. Look, I've been married for it'll be 9 years. 9 years this year. I love my husband dearly. I do not agree with him 100% of the time. Why on earth then would I be expected to agree with my political party 100% of the time? And this is where, I would say to my opponent who has voted 100% of the time, that is not real. That's not practical. That's a rubber stamp. None of us agree 100% of the time. And I think what Governor Hogan has done is, created a pathway for those of us who are more inclined to think independently and say, look, I'm going to look at every single issue and think of what is best for the people of the 3rd Congressional District. And I'm going to do it, yes, through a lens that is small government and fiscal responsibility, but that doesn't mean that I'm going to toe a party line. It means that I'm going to focus on the people in the 3rd District.
You bring up Dobbs. Let's talk about the abortion issue, because do you agree with what the Supreme Court's ruling on the Dobbs decision?
I think that we can certainly get into the legal ruling, and Ruth Bader Ginsburg, the late Ruth Bader Ginsburg, was one of the loudest critics of Roe versus Wade, how it was decided, and trust me, I'd love to have that legal discussion. But I think the real question that's on people's minds is whether or not you think that women should have access to abortion. And in that response, I would say, look, I'm a woman. I've had 2 children. I know what it feels like to carry a child. I've felt their hiccups and their kicks. I know what it feels like to have a life inside of you. I also know what it's like to hold the hand of a friend who is in that position and is not ready for it and is terrified. And Mackenzie, I said to her, we were 19 years old and I was in college, and I said to her, if this is the situation, give me the baby. And you know what? What was I going to do, Mackenzie? I was 19 years old. Like, I was going to take care of a baby. And she said to me, adoption is not an option. It just isn't. And for a lot of women, it is not a realistic option. We talk about being pro-life. We talk about saving these children. And then when they're born, what? It costs $30,000 to adopt a child in this country. When I think of the foster care system, I think of Oliver Twist. And I think most of us still do. So if we want to focus on real solutions, we will help those women who are in those positions. We will make adoption and foster care real options for people. But those are things that we can no longer do in a courtroom. You have to do those on the ground. The pregnancy clinic in Annapolis just held a walk last month. How many of the people who are pro-life were there? Like, these are the institutions, these are the clinics who help women through that time. So for me, it's not about a courtroom anymore. I'm not having this fight in court anymore. This is a decision that should be left to the states. This is a decision that women should be able to make, and those of us who claim to be pro-life should stand behind them and make sure that there are always options available. But in reality, I think it is up to a woman to decide.
So it sounds like you would not support a bill that was introduced recently that would implement a federal national ban on abortion after a certain amount of weeks. Is that something you would stand behind or no?
It's interesting because a lot of the people in Maryland Maryland actually has some of the most the least restrictive abortion laws, excuse me. So the most progressive, the least restrictive. I believe you can actually get an abortion up until birth here in this state. It is the most progressive law, and I am not a proponent of that, and I think the majority of the population is in the camp where we're not on the extremes. No access is not okay. Up to birth or partial birth, also not okay. The majority of people are somewhere in the middle. What's interesting about the question as to whether or not it should be at the national level, we really forget that the federal government does not have infinite authority. You have the authority, I have the authority, our state legislatures, that's how our Constitution intended it. It was not for the federal government to decide. So the first thing that I'd say is, look, I think Congress would have to figure out if they even had the authority, the constitutional authority, to create any such mandate or any such statute or law. If they don't, then they don't. But like I said, I think the real question is whether or not women should have access. And my answer to that is yes.
Let's talk about the economy and jobs, because inflation obviously is a big issue on top of mind for a lot of families across the country, Maryland, and in the communities that you're looking to represent. How do you address the rising inflation and the problems that that's putting on families?
I love this question, Mackenzie, because it is devastating to a lot of people. I go grocery shopping every Sunday. It's my least favorite activity to do.
Same.
Yeah. I went this past Sunday and I scanned. I go to Sam's and I used the scanner and I got eggs, and then I scanned them, and then I was moving on and I looked at it and I said, wait a second, what did I just see? And I looked at the price of eggs, which has skyrocketed, which on top of this price of juice, and on top of the price of milk, and on top of the price of cereal, and I'm looking at these, and I actually looked back at my receipt from several months ago to where it is today, and I was like, I am not buying extra things. I am buying the same things that I did 6 months ago. Right. And it costs dramatically more. And this is a real issue for the majority of Americans. And how do we deal with this issue? The way we deal with this issue is to first figure out how we got here, right? If you continue to make the same mistake over and over again, right, and you have no intention of choosing anything different, then you are going to keep ending up with the same problems over and over again. I think the biggest issue that we've had with the creation of inflation, and yes, it started with the Trump administration, it started during COVID, and this again is where, like Governor Hogan, I would say, look, either Republicans, we are fiscally conservative, or we're not. The $6 trillion that were spent over the last couple of years started with the Trump administration and ended with the Biden administration. So it's a very bipartisan issue, this overspending. But when we look at where to spend our money, and this is where a lot of people, I think, misunderstand the conservative idea of fiscal responsibility. It's not to say you're not going to spend money. You are. I mean, you have a budget in your home, right? So you may not want to overspend, but that doesn't mean you're not going to spend. You're going to spend on your mortgage or your rent or your car payment or whatever it is. You are still going to spend it on the things that you need. But we have to prioritize. And in this country, we don't do that anymore. We don't prioritize. You have people who have been in office for 15 years, like my opponent, who rather than prioritize, stay in office because he is very beholden to special interests. So when they want something, he gives it to them. And you've got a lot of members of Congress who have spent decades in office who do that all across the country. And so rather than prioritize on the American people, they focus on their special interest groups who keep them in office. And that has to stop.
That sounds like a long-term plan. I don't really think American families care about the long-term plan when they can't afford to buy groceries right now. So how do congressional members look at this problem and come up with a solution that could lower the price of groceries and gas and everything that is impacting people, more immediately?
Well, I think it's not quite as long-term, because you can see how very quickly the COVID pandemic started 2 years ago. And 2 years ago, we were not talking about inflation. We were not talking about skyrocketing gas prices. Those are issues that happen really within about a year or so. And so those are issues, once we start, for example, OPEC just recently made the decision to cut their production of oil by 2 billion barrels a day, I believe, or 2 billion gallons a day. That's going to have a significant impact here in the U.S. Now, we could look at that and say, well, what is the president going to do about OPEC? As if we here in America don't produce cleaner energy, cleaner oil, and have done for many, many years. When you increase the price of oil, you then increase the price of the transportation of the goods that use that oil to move those things around the country. So if we think, exactly, so if we think that inflation is risen right now, wait until November hits, they cut that production, and we face even higher prices. But again, those are problems that we could deal with right now. We could open our reserves. We could, and again, and I say this to my friends who are environmentalists all the time, I am right there with you. We have to take better care of our environment. We have to look at cleaner energy. But we also have to recognize that knocking on the door of Saudi Arabia or Argentina or even Russia, for heaven's sakes, and asking them to produce more oil that is less, that is much worse for the environment than the oil that we produce here is not environmentally friendly. It's just don't see, don't tell. I'm not going to see it, so I'm not going to ask about it. That is not responsible environmental process.
I want to talk about education, and there's two parts to this. There's the higher education costs and problems, and then there's K through 12 education. Starting with higher education, the student loan forgiveness plan right now, do you think that that was a good idea from the president, and would you support expanding that to even more people who perhaps could qualify?
I'm going to give you the shortest answer that I've probably given you all day. No. No, and I have student loans. You know, I went to law school. My parents didn't have 2 dimes to rub together. So, you know, it was all hopes and dreams and make good grades and, you know, get a scholarship, get a grant. So I had student loans as well, but no. And I'll tell you why. Because it doesn't solve the real issue. One, the amount of student loan debt that is going to be forgiven will be to people who have higher degrees. So law school, medical school. Those are the folks who have a lot of this debt. So you're not really targeting it to the people who needed the help. Exactly what we did during COVID with the stimulus. We handed out everybody got a $1,400 check, but we didn't give it to the people who actually needed it. So you still had people who need help. And it's going to simply create a situation in which 10 years down the road, we're going to be faced with the exact same obstacle. Here's what we really should do. I'm assuming that what the Biden administration wants to do, and I know what I want to do, is lower the cost of education, correct? That's what we want to do, lower the cost of education. Here's how we do it. You have to get the federal government out of the student loan lending process. When the federal government stepped in and said, I am going to back these loans, guess what schools did? They raised their prices. You know why? Because it's very easy. If I go to you, Mackenzie, and I say, hey, you're going to go to school, but I'm going to charge you $20,000, and you might say, I can't afford $20,000. But if in comes the federal government and says, Mackenzie, don't worry about it. I got the $20,000. You just pay me back. It'll be a little bit at a time. So if I'm the college, all of a sudden I say, well, how's $21,000? How's $25,000? How's $30,000? And the federal government continued to back those prices. And you continued to do what you had to do, right? Go to college. So the price skyrocketed. You have to get the federal government out of the student lending process. You have to target the aid where it's needed. We need teachers. We need, particularly teachers. There are certain industries where if we chose to allow grants or to increase the number of grants in those specific areas, then yes, I do think that would be a good idea. And the other thing that we have to do is recognize that trades are higher education. It cannot just be about college. You know, I'm the oldest of 5, Mackenzie. My 4 siblings and I all have higher education degrees. My youngest brother is a welder. Guess who made the most money out of school with the least amount of debt?
Him.
It was the welder. Yeah, trades are higher education.
If you remove the federal government from the lending process, does that open the door for predatory lending?
I would say that the federal government is guilty of predatory lending. They might be the biggest perpetuators of predatory lending. I remember being 18 years old and being told I could sign on the dotted line here and I could get a student loan for, you know, whatever my college tuition was at the time. One of the biggest things, and I didn't mention this in the last answer, we have to teach financial literacy. You've got to teach financial literacy in high schools. There are kids who are graduating right now who don't have a clue what an interest rate is, who have no idea what a 401k is. So when they sign on the dotted line for a student loan that has a 6% interest, they have no idea how that's going to balloon by the time they graduate 4 years from college. And then all of a sudden that $4,000, that $10,000 loan that they took out suddenly looks like $100,000 when it's all said and done. So when it comes to the issue of predatory lending, the fact that the federal government would set 18-year-olds up for this type of situation, which we've seen now over the last 2 decades, is predatory lending. It's the very definition of it.
You bring up teaching various subjects in school. Looking at K through 12, the movement of parental involvement has gained a lot of steam, especially during the pandemic. I think parents were at home with their kids. They were more involved perhaps than they ever had been before. What do you see the role of parents, school administrators, and students working together, putting the curriculum together? Is that a good idea, or should parents be kept out of that process and leave it up to the people who went to school and have the education background to put the curriculum together?
I think the real issue isn't so much putting the curriculum together, it's what is in the curriculum. So if you're talking about traditional, when I went to school, right, I'm 38 years old, so when I was in school, the subjects that were being taught were math, science, reading, writing. These were the subjects that were taught. The issue for a lot of parents today is that we're not talking about that. Look, I'm not a calculus teacher. The calculus teacher will set the curriculum. I promise you I will have nothing to do with that. But when my child is in a calculus class and no longer being taught calculus, but all of a sudden we are talking about different issues, social issues, particularly for the younger students. And I'll be honest with you, I when it comes to the older students, particularly juniors and seniors, you can start to have a little bit more mature conversation with them because they are, we'd hope, a little bit more mature at that point, right? The real issue isn't whether or not parents should be deciding the curriculum, it's what is being taught as a core subject now. Like I said, if it's history, if it's science, if it's math or reading, then by all means, I have no idea how to teach a second grader how to read. It's an incredible process to me. And my daughter's second grade teacher, hats off to all of you, it's incredible. But I think for parents, the real question is what is being taught, not necessarily how it's being taught.
What is being taught is the conversation right now. Do you think that some of these social culture issues like gender and sexual orientation, different family unit structures, is that not something students should be learning about?
Where should they be learning that? At home or in the classroom is the question. I have 2 daughters and I will talk to them about these issues when I feel that it is appropriate for them to know about these things. I don't believe my 5-year-old is going to hear this interview, so I'll tell you now. She does not know that unicorns don't exist. This is the mind of a 5-year-old. This is the mind of a kindergartner. And so when we talk about social issues, again, when she's in kindergarten, they're learning, I think the last email from her teacher said they were learning to write numbers 1 through 10. They are learning colors. When they walk into her preschool class, this was last year, they would walk in and get a dinosaur and sit down on their little, colored mat with their name on it. These are the things that their brains are equipped to handle at this point. But when it comes to the social issues, again, I think for a lot of parents, and I do recognize, of course, look, we live in a very open society. There are a lot of different types of families, and the one thing I will say that no one should ever be made to feel like they don't belong. Bullying at any level should not be tolerated in schools, and that goes from 20 years ago to today. But I think for a lot of parents, it's that fear of what else is being taught. How is this being taught? It's not the core subjects. And again, we suddenly seem to think that it's our school's role to teach our children these things. And I think maybe some of that comes back on us as parents as well. We have to be willing to have these conversations with our children as well. And no, I don't believe that they should be happening in school in the sense that I think there's this great fear about it. And when it comes to age appropriate, I think that's one of the parents' biggest fear is what we're discussing, age appropriate.
Is it becoming blown out of proportion? You know, I feel like is it a topic that becomes a reality because people are talking about it rather than it was actually happening in classrooms?
That's a great question, and I wish I knew the answer. Unfortunately, it could be a self-fulfilling prophecy in the sense that I know a lot of parents have had those questions, and rather than had them answered, you know, if I ask you a question or you ask me a question, you get the answer and then we move on to another one, right? The problem, unfortunately, with a lot of these issues is that a lot of parents have asked questions and then they got the door slammed in their face, which does not answer questions, it raises more and raises suspicion. And I think we're at a point now where there are a lot of angry parents and there's a lot of suspicion. And so how we deal with that, I think we have to be more open to communicating. Remember that parents and teachers are on the same page, right? We are on the same page in a lot of ways, but also recognize that, look, there are some educators who do come into the classroom with their own philosophies and their own ideas, and rather than teach the subject that they were instructed or that they were hired to teach, they take it upon themselves to teach something different.
Looking at the topic of school funding, because, you know, obviously there's a lot that goes into how schools are funded, public schools specifically, local, state, federal taxes goes into all of that. Do you believe that parents should be able to use that money that their student receives or their school district would receive for their student and take that money elsewhere? Should the dollars follow the students if parents have the choice?
School choice? Yes, I do believe that. I do believe that. And look, my kids are in a great school in Severna Park. We paid the extra taxes to live in that area. I also worked in Baltimore City for the last 5 years. And the number of parents, the number of stories that I covered about the failing school systems, you know, the cost to educate a child in Baltimore City is close to $18,000 now. It's one of the highest in the country as far as per pupil spending in those schools. There's a fantastic private school just down the street from my home. My kids don't go there, but we did look at it during the pandemic. It was one of the only schools that was open, the private schools. And when I saw the cost was a fraction of what it cost to send a child to Baltimore City public schools. I mean, we're talking, I think it's $7,000 or $8,000 a year to send them to one of the top-rated private schools in Anne Arundel County, or $18,000 to send them to Baltimore City, to one of the public schools in Baltimore City. How does that make any sense? And if you're a parent, what do you want? The best thing for your child.
Quickly, let's talk about crime and law enforcement, because I know, is there a role for the federal government to help with recruitment? Recruiting seems to be a big issue for several different law enforcement agencies. How do you plan to address that?
Tone. You know, tone is the big issue. There is a role for the federal government, but one of the things that we have to remember is that, again, there's the separation between the federal government and the state government. They're, you know, at times two separate entities. We have to remember that. But where did this conversation start? It started at the national level. The defund the police movement started at the national level. And it's these issues, this national rhetoric that starts at the top, that you see it on the network televisions, on the late night shows, and then next thing you know, your local legislature is passing a bill not based on anything that's happened in this state or even in your area, but based on the national tone. And so, yes, in the sense that, you know, the federal government or even Congress has any role to play, it's in respecting what our police officers do. That's not to say that we don't hold them accountable. We should. There is it's about respecting our law enforcement, holding those accountable, and making sure that this is a functioning system. But we've also got to remember that when the national rhetoric gets to a point where, police officers are not seen as our safety net, but as our enemy, then we've got a huge problem.
Looking at holding not just police officers accountable, but criminals accountable too, is there room to make sure that there is criminal justice reform and accountability and things are happening appropriately?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, like if we stop for a second and not look at this as a Republican or a Democrat debate, and just look at this and say, if you have criminals on the street, we need to deal with that, right? they should be arrested, and then we can start to figure out, based on the type of crime, how long they should be arrested, how long they should be in jail for. We can start looking at the steps of our criminal justice system. But again, that doesn't require a Republican or Democrat lens. That requires a normal human being looking at this issue and saying, what is the best for our community? When it comes to police accountability as well, it's very similar to the teachers union. The police union and the teachers unions have a lot of similarity in the sense that they have a significant amount of pull over what the laws that affect them actually do. And again, you can't be tied to any union. You can't be tied to these from a political perspective. You've got to look and see, what is the role of our police department? It's to keep our community safe. They deserve our respect. They deserve our support. But also recognize that they are full of human beings, and human beings make errors as well. And so where the accountability butts up with the job of the police officer, they're not mutually exclusive. As a matter of fact, they're both accomplishing the same thing, to make sure that we have a functioning police system. And I think we can do that if we stop looking at this from a political lens.
Perfect. Yuripzy Morgan, that's all the time we have. Thank you so much. Good luck in the 3rd District.
Thank you.